All right. Hey, this is Jose Galison with No Way Jose on the Liberty Movement YouTube channel. Today I'm here with Jacob Daniel from Daniel 3, Obeying God Over the State. Before I get into it, I just want to go ahead and lay it on the table. I mean, as you can tell by his title, it's religious, and by the title, when you're seeing this, it's on Christianity and liberty. And but I'm an atheist. I'm an agnostic atheist. We're not going down that road. We're not doing a debate here, but just for the purposes of so you guys understand like what bias I have. Not that I really think it'll come into play, but just to put all the cards on the table so you guys know what's up. I came from a conservative Christian household though, so I mean I went to a Christian school and everything, so I'm kind of fairly well versed in there, not super well. I mean, I haven't gone to church in well over a decade. But yeah. So you want to introduce yourself, Daniel?
Yeah. So my name is Jacob, and I have a Facebook page and a YouTube channel called Daniel 3, Obeying God Over the State. I've been a Christian pretty much my whole life, and became a libertarian and 6 months later an anarchist, as the saying goes, probably 2 years ago-ish. After I became an anarchist, I started to try to, because I became an anarchist kind of through being introduced to Mises, Murray Rothbard, a lot of that, the Austrian school of anarcho-capitalism. Then I kind of tried to work backwards to connect that to my faith, because, as a religious person, I take my faith very seriously. It's something that is kind of central to my life. My life revolves around my faith mostly. And so when I started to get really deep into the political anarchy, I kind of wanted to take a step back and make sure it reconciled with my faith. At first I was pursuing that just kind of to make sure I wasn't in any like religious sense committing any heresies or, going too far, and just wanted to make sure I was kind of staying grounded. And what I discovered was surprising, which was that there's actually a deep-rooted connection between libertarian philosophy and anarchism and Christianity. There's actually some historical Christian figures who were anarchists. And even if you go back as far as the early church, there was a view of the state going back to the early church where the early church fathers and stuff actually considered it not a heresy to be an anarchist, but almost a heresy or grounds for being kicked out of the church if you tried to engage with the state, tried to gain some kind of political office or whatnot. So, I kind of started a journey, and, I met a bunch of Christian anarchists who already had pages and podcasts going. And, there's definitely a lot of statism in the church, in Christianity in the Western world. And so I just felt kind of convicted to, hey, I'm just one guy, but whatever, the more voices we have, the better. And I want to kind of clean my own house, so to speak. I'm also a big fan of Jordan Peterson, and that's something he teaches, clean your room. And, the Christian world, the church, that's kind of part of my room. And insofar as Christians have been part of the problem when it comes to being proponents of statism and of tyranny, I definitely want to be doing my best to be part of the solution.
Cool. Real quick, I'm sure. I mean, I didn't even bother to look it up before I did this. Daniel 3. I'm assuming you know it by heart, or you at least know the gist of it. I'm just kind of curious as what Daniel 3 is.
Yeah. So Daniel 3, and I don't know the whole story like verse by verse, but Daniel 3 is the story of Meshach, Radshach, and Abednego. And basically, long story short, while the Jews were in exile in Babylon, you have two stories in the book of Daniel. One was Daniel, which is more commonly known. That's Daniel in the Lion's Den, which kind of has a similar story. But I just went with Daniel 3 because I don't know, that story resonated with me a bit more. But yeah, the king passed a law saying that basically anytime a bell was rung or there was some kind of cue, people had to stop, bow down, and worship this golden statue idol that was of the king, Nebuchadnezzar.
Yeah, I remember the details on this.
Right. Yeah, actually, that's That's probably part of why I like that story so much. Is I remember the VeggieTales rendition, which was the bunny, like bow to the bunny or
the
something.
chocolate bunny factory.
Yeah, the chocolate. Yeah. Yeah, it's funny you brought that up. I was thinking about that as I was reciting the story. But yeah, so they were told to bow down, and they basically, in no uncertain terms, didn't. They stood while everyone else bowed. They were brought before the king, and he asked them, why they were refusing to bow like everyone else, and the penalty was being thrown into a fiery furnace, and they said, "Listen, we can't say for sure that." If God throws it, I mean, if you throw us into this furnace, that we will survive. But if it's God's will, He will save us. And regardless, we will not bow to anyone but God. And so I kind of felt like that was a good theme to kind of put my page around. I mean, and there was a lot of different biblical stories I could have pulled from, but that just felt like a good one. Just very heavy on the the bluntness and the imagery of not bowing to a king, only obeying God, kind of being the heart of Christian anarchy. Being that we as Christians should only view God as the legitimate authority, both in a worldly sense and in a moral sense, and the state is illegitimate and only serves to corrupt the authority of God.
Well, that little story kind of makes a perfect segue into my first topic that I just mentioned to you before this when we were talking. I just kind of wanted to go into. I mean, like I said, Daniel 3 is kind of defying the state, and I kind of wanted to go into the whole the couve. I don't want YouTube to get me, but I know when all the couve stuff started kicking off at the beginning, a lot of people. I was actually really hopeful that the religious community was gonna kind of play that, have the heart of like Daniel 3, there. And I mean, in some instances I was disappointed, in some instances I wasn't. And, I mean, it was almost like little isolated pieces here and there. And also, but there's something to it that it's weird almost that they stopped. It's like that was one of the first things to go, is them stopping the church services. So I don't know, I just kind of want to get your thoughts on that, see if you have anything to add to that or not. I mean, I just thought it was an interesting topic.
It is actually. I have a lot to say about it. I mean, when when it first came out, the lockdowns and kind of the COVID panic within its early days, we didn't have a lot of information. So at first I didn't get too uppity about it. It was like, listen, pandemics are real things and they can happen. So if, I was like, well, this is a pandemic. If the virus is as deadly as it potentially could be, maybe it makes sense for us to not be meeting in person for a little while until we get some more information. But about a month or two into it, when things started to get more severe, I started to lose my patience, because it just kind of seemed, that the whole flatten the curve narrative was being pushed beyond that it wasn't just about, hey, let's brace ourselves and get ready and then reopen. It was like, hey, we're just going to stay shut down indefinitely until you basically can't live your lives for the foreseeable future. And in that time, I started to kind of, because I had not actually done any kind of considerations before in terms of like, what libertarians and anarchists, what our stances should be on what we do during pandemics. Because, you don't want to shoot yourself in the foot. I mean, an example would be, although I would prefer everything to be voluntarily funded, if there is a fire in my house, I'm going to call the fire department, even though it is funded by taxation. I mean, it's not, it's a drop in the bucket, but still, it's like, I'm not going to shoot myself in the foot and not use state mechanisms while those are the only options. And so, if the market mechanisms for dealing with the pandemic don't exist and all we have are the state ones, then it's like, well, what balance do we have between like wanting to oppose statism, but also like not wanting to shoot ourselves in the foot? But, once we saw the virus was basically, something that if you took reasonable precautions, you could avoid spreading it to the people who were really at risk. We kind of started to realize that, people like you and me, if we got it, and actually, I actually already have had it. So I've been through that already. And I mean, it was not fun. I have asthma, so it definitely at times was pretty uncomfortable, but I got through it. And it was kind of like just it was kind of like a really bad flu, but yeah, it was. So then, as it relates to the church and what their response was, I was a little disappointed that they didn't do something. I could understand in certain situations that big corporate gatherings, the way they were before COVID, might not be ideal during it. You have, because some churches have a large population of people who would be considered risk factors. So, churches like that, I'm not really, judgmental of them. But when it gets to the point where we have to ask ourselves, as Christians, if we feel convicted by the things that we believe, are we doing what we're doing? Are we not meeting because we are concerned with trying to protect people, or are we doing it out of fear and submission to the state? And insofar as the church was responding kind of to the first thing, like wanting to protect people, I didn't have too much of a problem with it. But insofar as time went on, it seemed more and more like the church wasn't trying to make their own way as a whole. It seemed more or less like they were willing to follow whatever the state mandates were. That was kind of problematic for me. And sure, there were isolated incidents where churches did keep meeting. I think, what was it? Piper, I think, was one who I think he at first was with the lockdowns, but then as time went on, he kind of changed his tune. No, it wasn't Piper. It was oh God, I'm blanking on his name right now. One of the famous pastors in the Reformed world. I'm blanking on his name. Might have been was it MacArthur? Anyway, overall, most of the churches were staying closed for a while until here in Pennsylvania where I live. A couple churches have started to reopen. My personal church was closed for a while, just doing online streaming, and then started to do in-person gatherings slowly with limited capacity. Now we're back up to full capacity, so it's seemingly things are starting to get back to normal in that regard. But it did kind of agitate and kind of expose that the church doesn't have the view of the state that I think they should, which is that the state isn't an authority that they should submit to blindly, that they should ultimately seek to serve God, to serve what is right and wrong. And I don't think that was handled perfectly at all.
Yeah, I mean, I was definitely very disappointed overall with how this has been handled by the church. Because, like I've told you, I mean, I said I'm atheist, but still, like, I grew up in the church. Like, when this first started, my first thought was like, "There's no way the church is going to go for this. Like, there's no way." Because I remember growing up in the church, and it's like that sense of community, and also it was like this, like to some people that was like their identity, that was everything to them. And I was like, and also from being taught all the Bible stories and stuff, like, there's just no way. And like I get like trying to protect people and stuff, and like, but there's ways you can do that while being able to like meet in person. And even then, on top of that, a lot of those like communities that were like could have problems were a lot of the ones who wanted to still go to church. So it's kind of like like that's their choice to make.
Right. That was kind of my response. Was like, listen, why can't and this was my response to really everything, not just the church, but just our societal response. I kind of felt like what we should have done was say, listen, let's identify the people at risk and let's keep them isolated while we let this thing kind of run its course through the healthy part of the population that isn't at risk. And you can do that without having everyone locked down. And really it's more ideal to do that because what people, churches not meeting is one thing that really only affects Christians themselves, maybe some people's mental health or spiritual health, but the economy and stuff, shutting it down for as long as it's been shut down. I mean, people are not willing to make that calculation to realize how much worse we are, how many more problems we are causing between shortages of food, shortages of medicine and essential supplies, putting people into extreme poverty. I mean, I don't think that the long-term effects of these lockdowns are going to be fully realized for a few years yet. I mean, and not even just in those things, but also just the economic impact of the Federal Reserve, just continuing the printing of trillions of dollars.
Printer go burr.
Yeah, money printer go burr. Exactly. So, and it's like people laugh at that and laugh at the growing national debt. And what I like to highlight to people, libertarians especially, is like, taxation is theft, but inflation is almost a worse kind of theft. I mean, there's the
Double
kind of theft. Yeah, it's like there's the kind of theft where the government like takes your money, the money that you're earning and spending. But then there's the kind of theft where like the money that you are savings that are in your savings and the money that you're earning, the purchasing power that has is robbed from you. And that can sometimes be more damaging over time. Yeah. So
inflation's like more sinister in a way, because it's like most people don't get it. So it's almost like I don't know, it's almost more devious in a way. Like I get what you mean.
Right.
Yeah. So I don't know. One thing I wanted to bring up is kind of how I grew up in the church, and I didn't, until I had been gone from the church for a good while, I didn't even know that Anarchochristianity was like a thing. And like it kind of like blew my mind when I found out about it. And so like whenever I started this podcast, like being like the focus of this podcast and really the liberty movement at large that we've started, like the group, like the whole point is to like have like a cultural, non-political focus. And like religion seemed like a that's obvious, like what we're going for, like, and that's kind of always been a topic that's like fascinated me, because it's like looking back now, it's kind of like once I like found out about anarcho-Christianity and like that perspective on like Christianity, it just kind of like it all made sense, because it's like I don't know why this wasn't a thing already. I mean, it was a thing, but like it kind of is just weird why this is just a pervasive, like statism is such a pervasive thing in the church. Do you have any thoughts on like why that is, or no?
Well, it's mostly, in my opinion, traced back, and I say this with love for my Catholic brothers and sisters, but I would put a lot of the blame on when the church basically, I would describe it as kind of sold out with the conversion of Emperor Constantine, and when he kind of made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. I think that's what began the entanglement of Christianity, which was focused on the kingdom of God, with statism, and that kind of just continued to trickle down. Then the fall of Rome, then you had the Dark Ages, and then Christianity became tied to the monarchy, and you saw feudalism, and then the wars in Europe, and after the fall of the Roman Empire, the wars and the political drama between the Catholic and the Orthodox Church, and then the drama when the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, it's just kind of trickled down from there. And the saying, I'm sure you do, everyone's pretty familiar with it. When you trade, those who would trade liberty for security will get neither and deserve none. That's kind of what the Christians did. I mean, they were heavily persecuted for the first 300 to 400 years of their existence by the state, and then it was like it was kind of like when Satan offered Jesus in the desert, like all the kingdoms of the earth if he would just bow down. And it was almost like, I feel like Christians made that trade at that point in time. They said, hey, we're tired of being persecuted. Hey, we could actually be in positions of power for once instead of being constantly the underdogs. And I think that unfortunately that was the entryway for statism into the church. Because if you compare the writings in the view of the state from the early church fathers to everything that came after that, it really wasn't until the Protestant Reformation that you started to maybe see small resurgences of the kind of like no king but Christ anarcho-Christian philosophy, but it's still unfortunately a very small minority within the Christian world, both Eastern and Western.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I know. I'm kind of talking my butt a little bit because I used to be way more versed in this. Like we were talking before, I've kind of already passed my angry atheist phase, and now I've kind of moved past like just theism in general. I just don't really focus on it as much. So I used to be way more versed in this stuff. But I know, wasn't it the Romans that then adopted Christianity as their official religion for a while? I mean, I might be wrong. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah,
I think they were the first.
That was Emperor Constantine when he had his famous conversion, which is, some people debate whether it was legitimate or not, and whether it was more of a political motivated action to try to unite his empire against the enemies and stuff that he was facing. So, and it's tough because I do have respect for Catholicism as a whole and for my Catholic brethren. In some ways, there are aspects to Catholicism that I think can be compatible with anarcho-Christianity, but just historically speaking, that entanglement started then, I believe, and just traces itself through history. At that point, it pretty much, just Christianity became entangled with the state and pretty much stayed that way until America, really. And then
honestly, probably the past like 10, 15 years, it's only started to lose its grip recently, I think. Because I know growing up, I remember feeling it even under like Bush and stuff, and even maybe a little bit later. Even like I remember it was such a big deal with Obama, with like, what is he a Christian? Is he not?
True.
Oh my God, he's a Muslim. Like, you know what I mean? Like, right. I don't know. I know I got that feeling growing up, but I mean, maybe I'm just, I was also a little kid.
Well, culturally, America was still very Christian focused, but America was at least the first place where religious freedom, because of the separation of church and state, happened. Now, most people were still Christian, so there was still probably a heavy cultural push, and because politics is downstream of culture, the politics were still shaped by that. But there was at least more, religious freedom. Churches and different denominations weren't literally warring against each other once they got to the West, and once the idea of separation of church and state took hold, which was kind of an important development. It's the church still isn't perfect, but it's certainly improved since that entanglement has become less like, now there's still entanglement, but now it's more through our democratic processes, and not so much that we actually have, this mixture of the kings and stuff and the monarchy with the church, and that was always problematic.
Honestly, I feel like it's probably only the last two presidents that it's felt like it's loosened up a little bit. I know before that it was still like a vibe. I mean, I'm only 29, so I mean, like, my perspective on how things have been is a little bit off because I'm basing on my worldview. But one thing I wanted to bring up, I thought was kind of interesting, because I know Rome and like Constantine in general, prior to his conversion, Christians were well known as being like a thorn in their side. So it was almost like the ring of power type thing, where statism kind of took its greatest weakness and made its greatest power, and kind of offered the ring, and then the Christians jumped at it, and now it's kind of been biting them in the butt for a long time. So
yeah, no, you're right. Yeah. They were tired of being oppressed by the ring of power by Sauron, and when they had the opportunity to wield the ring, they unfortunately gave into that temptation, which is unfortunate, because when Jesus was offered that same temptation in the desert, he refused it. And I mean, on one hand, it's understandable, when you've been persecuted by the state for so long, when you can, it's understandable to get defensive to the point where you think the only option you have to end that persecution is to grab that power. But that is unfortunately that set a precedent that's still alive today. Christians still, unfortunately, predominantly feel like they have to grab state power both defensively to protect themselves from what they see as like a growing the growing secular movement in the culture, and B, to kind of in a reactive sense to kind of push back and impose certain things that they think need to be imposed via the state. The most obvious one being abortion and wanting to overturn Roe versus Wade. That little, I shared a meme on my page a while back that was actually, it was created by, you could tell it was created by a leftist, not like a libertarian, but it was still true. And it showed like Republican voters basically as like a donkey, and they were chasing like the Roe versus Wade was like the food being hung out in front of the donkey, and then the donkey's hauling all this stuff behind him, and it was like all the things that you can imagine criticizing Republicans for, which is the military industrial complex, the war on drugs, and all this all that stuff was like characterized in the wagon, and that's very true. They're very focused on, unfortunately, using the state still to do things that that's not what Jesus taught. When Jesus was rejected as Messiah precisely because he didn't do that. The Jews expected Jesus to be a political figure. The Messiah was supposed to basically come, free Israel from the reign of the Romans, reinstitute the kingdom of Israel in a political sense. But Jesus came and was rejected because he said, my kingdom is not of this world. I've come not to, I don't care about these earthly kingdoms. I care about the kingdom of God. And he focused on, the spirituality and morality, not on politics. And he taught to go out and be a servant, to go out and to affect change in people's lives by being a servant, and by bearing, ultimately by bearing your cross as he did. That's the model he gave us. It was to go out and change the world through our example and through the biggest things he told us to do were to love our neighbor as ourselves, to care for the widow, to care for the orphan, and he never told us to do that through the state. He never, and unfortunately, Christians now are kind of lazy because they know that they can try to put their responsibility and give it to state politicians, and they're like, oh, well, I am caring for the least of these because I'm voting Republican, and they're trying to fight for the rights of the unborn. So it's an unfortunate trap that they've fallen into, but more are starting to wake up to it, and doing my best to try to be a little bit of a dissident voice in the Christian community when it comes to using statism as a means to an end.
Yeah, I really feel like it's such a good example of why the whole one ring metaphor is so great, because that's the basic trap of statism in general. Is just everybody has this, whatever your thing is, whatever your worldview is, everyone likes to think that they're right, and maybe they are, and they're like, well, I'll utilize the state to be able to prove that I'm right, or to be able to make a utopia or whatever it may be, to be able to get people to take on my worldview. And it's just kind of sad that something like, especially like Christianity, while I am an atheist, I have my disagreements, but I mean, especially like if you look at the New Testament part of the Bible, pretty much there's not a whole lot to disagree with, at least in the doctrine that Christ teaches. I mean, it's not much there. I mean, so it is kind of sad to see them fall into that trap. I think let's move into viewer questions. We're already a half hour deep, and we have some like pretty good audience questions that will probably take up a good chunk of time. So we move on then. I could go on this forever.
Sure.
So I got a question from Derek from the Liberty Movement. He said, people have said that the Bible justifies the state. What is your opinion on their reasoning? And I don't know if you want to maybe do it from a context of doctrine or you just want to go on with that. So you can go for it.
Sure. Well, it's probably good to start out by bringing up the passage that is most often used to justify the idea that the Bible supports a state. People are most commonly going to bring up Romans 13. And I'll just read that. It's not too long. Romans 13. I'm reading from the what version is it? The NASB. Every person is to be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same, for it is a minister of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing. For it is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. Therefore, it is necessary to be in subjection, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience sake. For because of this you also pay taxes, for rulers are servants of God, devoting themselves to this very thing. Render to all what is due them, tax to whom tax is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. That's the most prevalent part of the passage. And on the surface, people hear that and go, okay, you have to obey the state. That's it. There are, first of all, and I'd be happy to share links that you could, post along with this. There are probably a dozen different takes from the Christian anarchists throughout history on why Romans 13 does not say that we need a state. I can't go through all of them here; it would take too long. But I'll highlight kind of maybe like two of the ways I come about it. One that's kind of simple and one that's kind of simple and thematic, and maybe I'll go a little bit into the actual scripture and some of the lines and why they're maybe perhaps misinterpreted, because these were written in Greek, and Greek to English is sometimes tricky. First, just thematically, we can just intuitively know that this is not justifying a state in all instances, or that we must obey the state in all instances. It's important to recognize that the most that Romans 13 can be said to say is that while states exist, you are to be subject to them. But we can tell from the whole entirety of the Bible that there is a limit to that. Because, I mean, again, and I'm speaking from the Christian worldview. If you're an atheist or an agnostic, you don't believe this. But if you are a Christian, you kind of have to believe that the Bible doesn't have contradictions. So if you see a contradiction, you have to kind of explore that a little bit. And the first thing I would ask, that I ask Christians when they bring this up, is I say, what do we have more examples of in the Bible? Do we have more examples of Jewish and Christian figures obeying the state and admonishing it, or disobeying the state and rebuking it? And it's pretty much all examples of rebuking it. If you actually look, the first mention of the idea of a state or some kind of like human authority isn't mentioned until 1 Samuel, and it's not brought up in a good context. I'll bring that up here really quick. It's 1 Samuel chapter 8. To give the background on this,
is that the one where they're trying to institute a king and,
yes,
and they're not having it? And
yes.
Whatever, do what you want.
so basically, to like oversimplify kind of like the Old Testament story up until this point, this is after Israel was freed from slavery in Egypt. They're already in Israel. This is before David. This is before Saul is appointed king. Before that, the Jewish people were basically ruled just by the like religious authorities, basically by the prophets, by Samuel. But his kids didn't really follow in his footsteps. They weren't, really obeying God. They were kind of doing their own thing. And so, and Samuel was getting old. So the Jewish people came to Samuel and said, "Hey, your kids don't follow in your footsteps. You need to give us a king like everyone else in the world has." So Samuel goes to God and says, "Hey, what do you want me to do about this?" So the Lord said to Samuel, "Listen to the voice of the people in regard to all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them." There was actually another story where God wanted the Israelites to come to like the mountain where he was like his presence was dwelling, and he wanted to come down and he wanted them to come up so he could like dwell among them, but they were too afraid and they stood back. And that's repeated pretty much throughout all Old Testament history. And to keep reading here, it says that they rejected me from being king over them, like all deeds which they have done since the day I brought them out of Egypt. And he's referencing like he brought them out of Egypt, and what did they do? First thing they did was they erected the golden calf. So idolatry and rejecting God runs deep in these people. They have forsaken me and served other gods, so they are doing to you also. So listen to their voice. However, you shall solemnly warn them and tell them of the procedure of the king who will reign over them. So Samuel spoke the words of the Lord to the people who had asked of him a king. And he said, "This is the procedure of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and place them for himself in his chariots among his horsemen, and they will run before his chariots. He will appoint himself commanders of thousands and of fifties, and some to do his plowing and to reap his harvest, and to make his weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will also take your daughters for perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and your vineyards and your olive groves and give them to his servants. He will take a tenth of your seed and of your vineyards and give to his officers and to his servants. He will also take your male servants and your female servants and your best young men and your donkeys and use them for his work. He'll take a tenth of your flocks, and you yourselves will become his slaves. And then you will cry out in that day because of your king, for whom you have chosen yourselves. But the Lord will not answer you on that day."
Glowing recommendation of statism.
Yes. Therefore, God thinks statism is good. It's like, no, God, the whole, the beginning of the biblical narrative is God rescuing his people and saying, not bow to me in this like mean tyrant way, but like, hey, God is our father. I know the best way for you to live. If you will follow me, if you will accept me living among you, he's trying to restore what was lost in the garden. He's trying to bring back that, the connection. And really, if you look back to the garden, even that was a rejection of God, where, Adam and Eve basically said, well, we don't need to listen to God. We can decide for ourselves, and we can rule ourselves and decide our own meaning and decide what is right and wrong. And that's the whole beginning of the biblical narrative. We get to hear at 1 Samuel where, a glowing recommendation, a glowing telling of what statism is going to look like is given to them. And then in Romans 13, it can be said that while the state exists, you're supposed to listen to them, but that can only be said to be applicable insofar as the state is not asking you to do anything contrary to God's law. And that's really the simplest answer to Romans 13, which is that, listen, be subject to the governing authorities if they tell you don't stab your neighbor or don't steal from your neighbor. But if Hitler tells you to go round up the Jews, you should probably not listen to that. You know what I mean? It's like you can't consistently read into Romans 13 that you are to obey all the state's authority. So the only consistent answer to that is to say, well, if the state is asking you to do something that's contrary to what is right, you can't obey it. And I push on that to, I think, the logical extreme that maybe some Christians don't, which is that what is statism? Statism is a monopoly of force over people in which some people have special rights to do what for us is immoral. It's like the state takes our wealth, but calls it taxation or calls it quantitative easing, as the Fed calls it, QE. It takes our wealth. It'd be wrong for you or I to do that, to take a group of people, hold them hostage, and tell them they have to use our currency and they constantly take their wealth from them in these various ways. But if these people do it and they call it a state and they call it taxation and they call it the Federal Reserve, it's okay. I don't see that in the Bible, and I've always asked people to show me that. It's like, show me where in the Bible God says, "Do not murder, do not steal, do not commit idolatry, except if you are a king, or except if you are voted democratically into a position within a state." Like that doesn't exist. God's moral commands have no exceptions. They are universal moral commands that imply universal moral duties upon us. And if you take seriously that you should not steal, that you should not murder, which is basically that's the non-aggression principle summed up right there. If you believe that, then there can't be any exceptions. So now, the more detailed scriptural answer to Romans 13 would go a little bit further, and it would say that Romans 13 really isn't talking about a state. What Romans 13 is talking about is governance. And governance isn't necessarily a state. There's an idea among certain Christian anarchists, and this is kind of the answer to Romans 13 that's my personal favorite, which is the idea that Romans 13 is really talking about civil governance, which you could equate to libertarian self-governance, which is basically that, if governance is just executing civil law, executing the enforcement of contracts, basically, is what it comes down to within the market. That if people murder or if people steal, that there has to be, some kind of response to that within the market. If contracts are broken, there has to be some kind of arbitration to resolve that. That is good. And what's funny about Romans 13 is it says that it is no terror for those who do good. Well, we automatically know then from that line that whatever Romans 13 is talking about cannot be the state, based upon the infinite amount of examples we have of the state being a terror to innocent good people. Whatever Romans 13 is talking about, it's saying that it's not a terror for those who do good, but only those who do evil. So the minute whatever you call governance starts to be a terror to those who are good or innocent, it's not protected by Romans 13. Romans 13 speaks to what we would call civil governance, or like libertarian. You could call it private. The Mises term is private law. Market anarchy. However you want to label it, that's what it's talking about. And when the line about paying taxes to whom taxes are due, well, that's kind of like, if we look at the Greek word there. It's really talking about like tributes or customs, which is like, yeah, listen, if you use a toll road, you got to pay the toll. It's really just kind of pushing more on that principle that like you can't steal from people, and if you use someone's property and there is a fine or a fee that is associated with that you have to pay it. It's actually kind of a it is mirroring Jesus's answer when the Pharisees asked Jesus if you should pay taxes to Caesar. And this is the other verse that people use to justify statism, is they say that, oh, well, Jesus said, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. And I was like, yeah, but if you look at what the Pharisees were trying to trick him, because it actually was, people, if you remember the New Testament, how tax collectors were viewed very badly. Like people said, like, oh, Jesus, that guy, he hangs out with tax collectors, which I kind of love that. Like, that's another thing is, it's not like tax collectors are talked about in a good way in the Bible, but, obviously the state must be viewed as good. Anyway, well, the reason tax collectors weren't viewed as good is because, the Jews still viewed the Roman authority as illegitimate, and, ultimately Caesar as a false king, and that, they were trying to trap Jesus when they asked him that question, because they wanted him to either say that you shouldn't pay your taxes to Caesar because he's a false king, and to have him be arrested for that, or to basically commit blasphemy in front of the Jewish people by saying you should. But what Jesus said was brilliant. He said, give me a coin. Whose face is on that? He said, uh, render to everyone, what they're owed, to Caesar what is Caesar's, and what to God what is God's. Meaning, like, which is just, to me, him saying, listen, just follow this principle of in the market that we all kind of understand, which is just like to play fair. Like, if you owe someone something, pay it. Don't steal from someone. Give to everyone what is owed. Which, if someone's stealing it from you via the point of a gun by the state, well, is that really owed, or is that being stolen?
I mean, you could look at that from a smartass perspective. If, like, say for me as an anarchist, if I said that, give unto the government what the government is owed, like, everyone's going to know, especially from the context of me saying it, I'm implying they're not owed anything.
Right. Exactly. Yep. So and Paul's mirroring that, and so between that and the entire biblical narrative, and when he says, so the other, just this is the last point I'll make on Romans 13, which is at the beginning when it says to submit yourself to the governing authorities. Well, the word there is, and I'm going to butcher the pronunciation of this word because I really don't know how to say it. It's in Greek. Is exousia, and exousia basically means higher powers, which is not used to describe the state in the Bible, except when it describes the higher powers being like evil. Is the only time it's used in two ways. It's used to describe higher powers in a good way, but whenever it's used to describe higher powers in a good way, it's being used to describe like God or forces of God, or like, God's moral authority. When it's used to describe the kingdoms of God, I mean the kingdoms of man, it's always like in this way that's like depicting them as terrible and tyrants. Now, it's certainly true that God uses evil for good, and there are times where God would use, certain earthly powers or earthly exousia to punish Israel for their disobedience. But just because God used Babylon or Persia or Rome to punish Israel for their disobedience doesn't mean that he was calling Rome or Babylon or any of these kingdoms of man good. Just because God uses the actions of evil men for his purposes doesn't mean that the actions of those evil men aren't evil. So those are that's the biggest challenge that is in the Bible against Christian anarchism. And really, once you break those down, there's really not much you have to deal with. I mean, I would say that Christian ethics would say that political, like violent revolution against the state probably isn't a good idea or justified. That kind of comes more from the Christian idea of kind of being against violence in most instances. Self-defense being, an exception. You're allowed to defend yourself. If someone's trying to hurt you or your family or your neighbor, you should obviously want to protect people from harm. And sure, the state does. There's a little bit of a gray area there. Some Christian anarchists are pacifists, and like to the extent where they would say that you should never resist the state with force. Others think that, well, statism is such a tyranny on people that it would be justified in certain instances. But ultimately, there's no argument to be made that statism is good in the Bible. It's just not there.
Yeah, it's funny. You actually, like, the ones you brought up are ones I remember growing up being told, because like I said, I came from a traditional Christian household, and it was like, very conservative, very, like that was the kind of stuff we heard too. So I'm going to move on to the next question. It's from David. I'm going to paraphrase it because it's kind of a long one and to shorten it up a little bit. Basically, he wanted to ask something along the lines of like the differences between denominations, and then also to tie into that, like, which denominations do you typically seem to lend themselves towards being less or more statist?
Yeah, that was an interesting question. I thought about that for a little bit. today.
Oh, just to cut in, I came from like a Baptist household, so I mean, I don't know if it's one of the trappings of like, church. Most people get stuck in a denomination. That's the only thing they know. I honestly don't even know much about the different denominations, even growing up in the church. So that one for me, I was like, I don't know.
There are certain aspects. I'll start with like the biggest one, as people know, which is like Catholicism, and Protestantism. So the Catholic Church isn't very anti-state, but you do find a hint of rejecting the state as an ultimate authority. Some of that's because they view the Pope and the Catholic Church as being kind of the ultimate authority of, it's the Catholic view being like the Church and the Pope are kind of like it's the apostolic succession, and they are kind of like God's voice and instrument here on earth. And there are some Catholics who are anarchists and good libertarians. I mean, Tom Woods is a good example of that. So, I mean, there's no denomination that really makes it impossible to be an anarchist. Catholicism does have this spirit of, there's so many rules and regulations, and there are some Catholics, excuse me, I have to clear my throat. There are some Catholics who, based upon, and like, I'd have to look into these things, but like certain things in certain Vaticans and church writings have told me that like you can't be an anarchist and a Catholic because like you need to be able to use the state to ban drugs and to ban abortion. That's I can't answer that, but I will say that it's not impossible for Catholics to be anarchists. There's some pros and cons there. Within Protestantism, it's a bit of a mixed bag. There are a lot of within, like, I'm kind of loosely from like the Reformed theological school of Christianity, like Presbyterians, Calvinists, that kind of stuff. And there are a good number of historical theologians from that those denominations that write against state tyranny and that are almost Christian anarchists. Then you have like, I guess, the more progressive denominations like the United Church of Christ, or just a lot of the non-denominational churches, but a lot of them are really left-leaning, so they are oftentimes big proponents of the state because of the left to the cultural left's influence on them. So I mean, I guess like the short answer is there's no denomination that's a bulwark of Christian anarchism, but there's also no denomination that is a major obstacle to it. And I try to make my project kind of a big tent or like an umbrella. I'm not going to discount any Christian denominations in my outreach. I think that now I can't say much about maybe like the ones that are more fringe, like Jehovah's Witness and Mormons. I do know Christian anarchists from both of those. I don't want to call them cults because that's offensive, but
just go ahead and say
it. But I mean, like I said, I know Christian anarchists of all persuasions, really. So I don't think there's any barrier. I can't say there's one that makes it easier, although I guess from the kind of like the non-denominational progressive theology part of Christianity seems to be where a lot of Christian anarchists today are. A big name is Keith Giles. He wrote a book called Jesus Untangled, which was about untangling our politics from our theology, which is a really good book, and I like it. But he just, his theology is much more within the Christian worldview considered liberal, very like not viewing the Bible as inerrant or believing that all of it is true to one extent or the other. So Yeah, that's about as much as I can say about that. There's no barrier to entry. Christians of all persuasions, there are plenty of examples of Christian anarchists to be found, and I can't say there's one that makes it easier than another, in my opinion. They probably all have their pros and cons.
Which makes sense because I mean, most of the differences from what I remember in denominations are just doctrinal kind of stuff that's not really doesn't really apply to that. But I mean, I was kind of interested if maybe you knew more than I did since you're more embroiled in this kind of thing. So,
It's like, I could speak to specific ones and tell you like which ones, like, oh, this one, like I said with the Catholic Church, there's a pro and a con here. Each one has a pro and con, but it would be kind of long and probably boring to go into all those.
Yeah, we don't want to get too much in the weeds.
Yep.
But let me see what else I got real quick. Let's finish off with this one. What role does grace play in your daily life from a voluntarist perspective? I don't know if you have much to say on that. I guess the way I interpret that was kind of like I know, especially even from not even from a religious perspective. I mean, say I identify more as like an agorist, and like so I would consider myself like a non-voting anarchist. And I know a lot of people get like all caught up on that, and like will be like, "Oh, you statist if you vote or whatever." And it's like it's kind of like, for one, my perspective from a non-religious perspective would be like I could be wrong, so it's like why would I be so judgmental on you? I mean, this is just my beliefs. I might be wrong. At the end of the day, it's not really worth like I don't know, ostracizing you in a sense over something so silly, So I don't know if you have something to say on that.
Yeah, what role does grace? Can you repeat the question one more time?
What role does grace play in your God? I brain farted it. What role does grace play in your daily life from a voluntarist perspective? I'm assuming grace they meant like from a religious perspective. So like, what? I mean,
Yeah.
that's
So,
kind of how I interpret
I guess here. So I'm remembering now what I wanted to say. One thing I will say is that maybe this isn't what they were going after, but this is kind of where my mind's going. Christians have a little bit of a different ethic, I think, overall than non-Christians that comes to bear differently when it comes to how we resist the state and also how we would solve things in the market. And I know that can sometimes cause some sorts of tension. Like one of the things that people sometimes don't like about Christian theology would be like when Jesus on the Sermon on the Mount says to turn the other cheek. And but to me, that's not saying that there isn't a wrong that is happening. Like if someone breaks a contract or infringes on your property rights, I think for society to work, you have to kind of label those things as wrong. But I think where grace comes to play for the Christian, kind of in the voluntarist worldview, is that the more you can solve things without implementing force, even as a way of like defensive force or restitutional force. The idea is that the biblical phrase is like when you love on your enemy instead of hating on them. It's like what was the expression? It's like dumping hot coals on their head. It's like sometimes punishment, and kind of going eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth leads to more of a dog eat dog world than you would want, versus if there is grace for at least the things that there can be grace for. I mean, I don't think, Jesus says turn the other cheek, not bend over. You know what I mean? Like, so
yeah, not take a bullet to the head either,
right.
Like,
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, and now the apostles died horrific deaths and Jesus did too. But they did that for religious reasons and kind of because, they didn't really have much of a choice. I mean, resisting the state back then was pretty much impossible. So, and, but yeah, I don't think that turn the other, turn the other cheek to me is like if someone is insulted you or if someone has, been petty with you in business, it's like they've done something that, you'd want to go after them, take them to court, try to sue them for everything they're worth. The Christian is going to be more motivated to let things go, which to non-Christians might view like it might be perceived in a way like, oh, you're just being weak or you're, letting people get away with stuff. But
Sometimes tactically it's the right way to go,
Yeah.
Because I mean, it just sometimes it's kind of like, I don't know, I've been married for almost a decade. It's kind of like picking your battles, the same idea. It's not everything's worth an argument,
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And sometimes you accomplish more good in the long run by showing someone grace than than by trying to go after them and make them pay for their wrongdoing. So I mean, that's the only thing I would say, as far as where grace applies to voluntarism in the market is, I mean, I think there's a lot of compatibility there and, in Christian ethics and voluntarism. I mean, uh, you know, we all want a world where there's not the predominant way of dealing with things is not initiating force against people. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of compatibility between Christian ethics and anarchism and voluntarism. It's just a shame that so many Christians have been brought up in this culture where they, are conditioned like we all are. Non-Christians the same. We're all indoctrinated by the state to normalize those forms of aggression and violence. But we all got to do our best to denormalize it, to view state violence and aggression for what it is, which is just, it's okay if it's not okay if I do it. It's not okay if someone does it and has a badge, or if someone does it and has, some kind of position they gained because they were voted into an office. Like I said before, murder is murder, theft is theft. The Bible upholds that, I would believe.
I feel like it's more pervasive though when it's instituted in a religious perspective of this, like incorporating statism into it as well, because it's like now you're incorporating a higher level of statism in a sense, because it's like, I know from my perspective growing up with it, because I came, like I said, it was kind of like they were almost like tied into each other in a sense. I mean, it was more in the subtext. I mean, don't get me wrong, like I don't think any church out there is preaching statism, but it's kind of like in a lot of places it's kind of in the underlying subtext. So it's like, I don't know, it kind of becomes embroiled into your even higher ideology. Because I mean, for someone who's religious, it's like you think you're going somewhere else after death. It's more than just life. It's something else. So I don't know. That's why it's kind of like I really like the idea of anarcho-Christianity, because like I said, I'm not the angry atheist anymore. So if anything, I like these ideas getting out, because I think it can serve humanity as a whole. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And there definitely is a danger to religion when it's tied to the state, because if you think that God, the creator of the universe, is on your side and you have state power, I mean, that's just a recipe for disaster. It just is. And and to be fair, it's a disaster no matter what religion does it. I mean, you look at Islam, pretty much the only religion that it hasn't been as bad as maybe Judaism, but that's just because they've unfortunately been on the receiving end of state violence more often than.
Hey, they're coming back.
Not. Yeah, I mean, unless
they're running the banks and stuff now.
Oh God. Yeah.
I'm just kidding. This video's gonna get taken down.
But yeah, no, I definitely understand where you're coming from. I'm not one to try to excuse that. Christians need to, they need to be consistent. They need to live up to what the Bible teaches. And when you challenge statism in Christians, unfortunately, they don't respond with scripture. Mostly, they respond with the mythos of American exceptionalism, which is a problem. And not that I hate America, or I hate everything about America and Western culture. That's not my point. But just that the idea that of democracy being a virtue, and that is a statist myth that is permeated everywhere in our society, including the church, and doing my best to combat that.
Yeah, it's like weirdly tied into the American mythos too, because it's like the whole shining city on a hill type thing has this weird religious undertones to it, and there's something to that where it's like we're gonna bring freedom and our Western culture to the world kind of deal. So, and I feel like that's kind of like implied, the Christianity and stuff, especially in the like couple decades past. Maybe not so much now. It's kind of coming back around, but. I mean, I think you get what I'm saying.
I totally get it. And it's just, it's frustrating because, I mean, there's nothing in the Bible that says to use the state to evangelize or to use the state to spread. I mean, the words democracy are not found in the Bible. Democratic. If democracy is such a virtue, you think the Bible would mention it once, but there's nowhere in the Bible where it says, "Hey, if the majority has the will to the power to enforce their opinions on the minority, that's great." Or if it's like it's just silly.
Morality goes out the window when you have more people vote for it.
It's sad, and it's tough because the American mythos does have a lot of Christianity mixed into it as well, because you're taught in school and in church that like the founding fathers were Christian, and America is a Christian nation, and it's definitely a problem. I won't say that all churches and all Christians are like that. I've met plenty of Christians who don't talk that way, but overall they are still kind of bogged down by like the it's like the metaphor you brought up with the ring of power. It's the problem in all areas of life when you have this the religious community versus the non-religious community, the left versus the right in the culture wars. It's like the problem is that people can't freely disassociate and associate how they want to and live voluntarily when they're afraid of people who don't share their values completely taking that ring of power and using it against them. And until we throw it into Mount Doom and get rid of it for good, we're going to, people are going to fight over it until enough people say enough is enough, and figure out a way to give up the ghost on that.
Yeah. With that, I think we're going to bring it to a close. You got any plugs you want to drop? I mean, obviously these will be in the video description as well. So I mean, you'll just send me those after, and I'll put them in the video description. But I'm going to give them now.
Just look up, Daniel 3, Obeying God Over the State on Facebook. I also have a YouTube channel with some videos up. Website in the works, but not up and running yet. But you can go check that out if you want to look more into what I'm doing, and also check out Anarchochristian and the Bad Roman Project. Stephen Rose and Craig Hargis, good friends of mine who are also big into this movement of Christian anarchism.
Yeah, I want to have them both on at some point, but I mean, I don't want to do like back-to-back Anarcho-Christian episodes, but right. I'm sure we'll go into those again later. I'm going to go into our plugs real quick. I want you to stick around because I want to talk to you a little bit after the broadcast. But for us, keep in mind, this is the Liberty Movement YouTube channel. We have the Facebook group. It'll be in the description as well. The whole point is we're trying to get a non-culture or a non-political cultural movement going. Essentially, we're trying to move liberty through the culture. We also have the email that will also be in the description, the Liberty Movement global at gmail.com. Big thing is with everything going on with Facebook, I'm zucked right now. Like, I can't interact with, I forget what it's, complex entities, whatever the heck that means. Basically, I'm not able to post or comment in groups. So yeah, I mean, we'd already been talking about this before, but this kind of put the rush on. We're really trying to put together an email list. So if you're in the group already, you can send it to me, or you can send it to David, who's another one of the admins, or you can send it to the email, because basically we're just trying to collect emails. We're trying to get an email list going together, and in the future we're looking towards having maybe like a newsletter, kind of like how Tom Woods goes, so that we can kind of keep in touch. Because anyone who knows anything about the Liberty Movement Facebook group, it's a whole network of groups, and we kind of had it all set up, but we're trying to set up an infrastructure, and Zuck isn't really having it, so we need to have backups. Also keep an eye out. We're probably going to be going on a website here soon, and I brought up the newsletter. So with that, that's really all I have to say. Tomorrow, keep a lookout. I have my friend. It's kind of ironic. We had a Christianity episode where I have a buddy that's works at a grow house who's a big in hallucinogenics and marijuana, just drugs in general. And we're going to be doing a drugs episode tomorrow. So keep a lookout for that. And with that, deuces.